This was not metaphor. This was policy. The great empires of the ancient Near East, the civilizations that had risen from the river valleys of Mesopotamia, and spread their authority across thousands of miles of conquered territory, had perfected a specific technology of power whose fundamental principle was the systematic destruction of everything a conquered people held dear. The Assyrians, who had dominated the ancient world for 3 centuries before their own sudden collapse in 612 BCE, had elevated this technology to a form of imperial art. They deported conquered populations by the tens of thousands, ripping entire peoples from the land, whose soil held their ancestors' bones, whose rivers ran through their oldest stories, whose temples housed the gods whose favor made life intelligible, and resettling them in foreign territories among foreign peoples, whose language they could not speak, and whose gods they did not know. The Assyrian annals recorded these deportations with bureaucratic precision and something that reads, across the millennia, disturbingly like pride. Kings listed the numbers of people they had displaced the way modern governments list infrastructure projects, as evidence of capability, of administrative reach, of the comprehensive authority that separated the great from the merely powerful. The psychological logic was merciless and effective. A people stripped of its land, its temples, and its cultural continuity is a people whose resistance has been dismantled at its foundation. You cannot fight for a homeland that no longer exists. You cannot organize rebellion around a religious tradition that has been physically uprooted, whose sacred objects have been carried away as spoils of war, whose priests have been killed or scattered, whose rituals require a geography that conquerors have deliberately made inaccessible. The Assyrian deportation system was not simply cruelty for its own sake, though it contained cruelty in quantities that modern observers find overwhelming. It was a sophisticated strategy of cultural annihilation designed to do permanent submission, by making the cultural identity that motivates resistance impossible to maintain. The Babylonians who succeeded the Assyrians carried this tradition forward. Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled Babylon from 605 to 562 BCE and whose military campaign the most feared his generation, captured Jerusalem in 597 BCE and again in 587 BCE, destroying Solomon's temple, the physical home of the God of Israel, the sacred center around which Jewish identity organized itself, and deporting the Judean population to Babylon in the event that Hebrew scripture would call, for generations afterward, the Babylonian captivity. The deportees who sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept, as the Psalms record, were living the standard imperial experience of the ancient Near East. Conquered, displaced, stripped of the physical anchors of their identity, left to contemplate in the bitter leisure of captivity, whether their God had abandoned them, or whether their God had simply been defeated by a stronger God, whose king sat in the ziggurat city of Babylon, and commanded the world. It was not only the Judeans. Across the ancient Near East, dozens of peoples lived in variations of this condition, displaced by Assyrian or Babylonian conquest, separated from their homelands, their temples occupied or destroyed, their cultural traditions surviving only in the stubborn human determination to remember. The world of 560 BCE was a world organized around the principle that power meant the right to obliterate, to erase the identities of weaker peoples and replace them with the identity of the empire that had proven itself stronger. Into this world, from the mountains of southwestern Iran, a king was rising. His name was Cyrus. And everything he was about to do would violate every precedent the ancient world had established for how empires were built, and how conquered peoples were treated. He would create the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey to the borders of India. He would conquer Babylon, the greatest city in the world, without a battle. He would free the Judeans from captivity, and return them to their homeland, and fund the reconstruction of their temple, from imperial treasury. He would issue a declaration, preserved on a clay cylinder discovered in the ruins of Babylon in 1879 CE and now housed in the British Museum, that some scholars have called the world's first human rights document. He would conquer the ancient world not primarily through the sword. He would conquer it through something far more unexpected and far more durable. He would conquer it through respect. The ancient world did not know what to make of him. Neither entirely does the modern one. He appears in the Hebrew Bible as the Lord's anointed, the only Jewish figure in Hebrew scripture given the title of Messiah. He appears in Greek historical tradition as the model of the just king, the ruler whose character justified his authority. He appears in Persian tradition as the father of his nation. Baba, the Persians called him, the word for father. He appears in the archaeological record as a conqueror who systematically broke every rule that conquerors had followed for centuries. The story of how one man's radical idea about power transformed an empire and left a mark on the concept of human dignity that has not faded in 2,500 years begins in the mountains of Persia. It begins with a boy who was supposed to die before he could change anything. The ancient world loved a story of the child who should have died. Moses in the basket. Romulus and Remus nursed by a wolf. Oedipus left on the mountain. The narrative of the infant whose destruction is decreed by power, whose survival is achieved through some combination of fate, divine protection, and the ordinary human mercy of someone who cannot bring themselves to carry out the order, recurs across ancient cultures with a frequency that suggests it was touching something true about how extraordinary people come into the world. Whether literally true in every case or not, these stories carried a message that resonated across millennia. That the greatest threats to established power come from below, and that power is never more dangerous than when it tries to preemptively eliminate what it fears. The story of Cyrus's childhood, as told by the Greek historian Herodotus, our most detailed ancient source for the early Persian king's life, writing perhaps a century after the events he describes, follows exactly this pattern. Astyages, king of the Medes, was the most powerful ruler in the ancient Near East in the first half of the 6th century BCE. The Median Empire controlled a vast territory in western and northwestern Iran, extending into Anatolia, and Astyages had consolidated that power through military force and the dynastic marriages that were the ancient world's preferred instrument of strategic alliance. He gave his daughter Mandane in marriage to a Persian nobleman named Cambyses of the Anshan royal house, the Achaemenid dynasty, descended from a king named Achaemenes, whose claim to rule the Persian region rested on lineage, local loyalty, and the cautious political wisdom of knowing when to acknowledge Median overlordship, without permanently surrendering Persian identity. The marriage was political calculation on Astyages' part. The Persians were a subject people, related to the Medes in language and culture, sharing the same Iranian ancestral tradition, but clearly subordinate in the imperial hierarchy that Astyages commanded. Marrying his daughter into the Persian royal house gave the Median king a form of control over Persian succession, a string attached to the future of a people whose independence he had absorbed but perhaps not entirely trusted. Then came the dreams. According to Herodotus, Astyages experienced two prophetic dreams that his court interpreters, the Magi, the priestly class whose expertise in divination, astronomy, and religious ceremony gave them a central role in Median political life, interpreted as predicting that Mandane's son would one day overthrow the Median kingdom and rule in his grandfather's place. Ancient kings took their dreams seriously in ways that modern secular culture finds difficult to fully appreciate. Dreams were not, in the cosmology of the ancient Near East, merely the brain's nocturnal processing of daily experience. They were communications from divine powers about the shape of future events, warnings and instructions that carried the authority of the divine will and demanded response. Astyages responded with the clarity of a king, who had not yet learned that some futures cannot be prevented by the methods available to the present. He summoned his most trusted official, a nobleman named Harpagus, and gave him the infant grandson to kill. Harpagus, confronted with the order to murder the son of the king's own daughter, knowing that if the prophecy was true, the child would grow up to rule, and knowing equally that a king who feared that prophecy would equally fear the man who had shown mercy when ordered to kill, made the choice that careful men make when placed between two terrible outcomes. He delegated. He gave the infant to a herdsman named Mithridates and instructed him to expose the child in the mountains, to leave him in the wilderness to die of exposure, which would technically fulfill the order without requiring any specific person to commit the direct act of murder. The herdsman's wife, whose name Herodotus gives as Sino, meaning dog or wolf, which may be a later mythologizing addition to the story, had recently given birth to a stillborn child. She persuaded her husband to keep the infant alive and raise him as their own, substituting the dead child as the evidence of compliance that Harpagus would require. The child survived. He grew up among herdspeople in the mountains of Persia, or, in the alternative historical tradition that sets aside the Herodotean legend entirely, he grew up at the Persian court of Anshan, as the of Cambyses and Mandaean, heir to the Achaemenid dynasty. Educated in the Persian noble tradition of horsemanship, archery, and truth-telling that Persian culture placed at the center of its conception of proper manhood, the truth of Cyrus's early life is not recoverable with certainty. What is recoverable, through the Herodotean tradition, through the Babylonian sources, through the Cyrus cylinder, and the administrative records of the empire he built, is the character of the man he became. And that character carries the marks of an upbringing, whether mythologized or historical, in which the comfortable assumptions of inherited privilege were not available, in which power had to be understood from the perspective of those who lacked it, in which the experience of subordination, Persian subordination to Median overlordship, whatever his personal childhood circumstances, shaped an instinct about authority that differed fundamentally from the instincts of men born into unquestioned supremacy. Cyrus grew up understanding what it felt like to be the lesser power. The understanding would become the foundation of an empire. At some point in his youth, ancient sources differ on the details and the timeline, the truth of his origins was revealed. The specific mechanism of the revelation varies between sources. Herodotus provides an elaborate story involving a childhood dispute, a punishment that revealed the boy's noble bearing and provoked investigation, and a recognition scene in which the herdsman confessed the truth to Astyages. What matters for the story of the king Cyrus became, is the consequence of the revelation. Astyages discovered that his order had been disobeyed, that his grandson lived, and that the prophecy he had tried to prevent was now in motion. He punished Harpagus. The punishment was the kind that ancient kings who ruled through terror and the demonstration of unlimited personal power, employed when they wished to make unforgettable points about the consequences of disobedience. Herodotus's account is sufficiently graphic that modern readers encounter it with the same visceral shock that ancient audiences likely intended. Harpagus was invited to a royal banquet. He was served a meal. When the meal was over and the serving vessels removed, a covered basket was brought forward. Inside it were the head, hands, and feet of Harpagus's own son, whom Astyages had killed and cooked and served to his father while he ate unknowingly. Harpagus, confronted with what he had consumed, said nothing. He collected the remains of his son. He went home, and he waited. He waited for years, nursing the specific, cold, patient hatred of a man who has been subjected to something so monstrous that ordinary revenge is insufficient, who requires not satisfaction but justice, and who is willing to wait for exactly the right moment to deliver it. When Cyrus raised his rebellion against Median overlordship, Harpagus, by then a senior commander in Astyages' own army, switched sides on the battlefield. His defection was not merely a military setback for Astyages. It was the collapse of the Median king's control over his own army, engineered by a subordinate whose loyalty had been destroyed by an act of power so excessive that it transformed obedience into its opposite. Cyrus, the boy who should have died in the mountains, was about to become the man who built the world's largest empire. He would remember what it felt like to be the smaller power. He would bid his empire accordingly. The ancient Near East in 559 BCE was a world of established hierarchies front had appeared from within them permanent. The Median Empire that Astyages commanded stretched across a vast territory in northwestern and western Iran, with vassal states and client kingdoms acknowledging Pasargadae from Anatolia to the edges of Mesopotamia. The Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar's successors controlled southern Mesopotamia and the Levant. The Lydian kingdom of Croesus, fabulously wealthy, the source of the proverbial expression rich as Croesus, whose treasury was among the largest in the ancient world, dominated western Anatolia, with the confidence of a state that had survived and profited from the convulsions of its neighbors. Egypt under the late Said dynasty sat, in its ancient naivety, maintaining the dignified immobility of a civilization that had been old when everyone else's civilization was young. These were the great powers. Persia was not among them. The Achaemenid Persian kingdom of Anshan, the political entity that Cyrus inherited when he became in 559 BCE, was a subject state of the Median Empire. It was a regional power of the second order, significant enough to have its own king, its own dynasty, its own traditions and identity, but clearly subordinate to the Median overlordship that Astyages embodied. Persia paid tribute to Media. Persian kings acknowledged Median authority. The relationship was not one of voluntary cooperation between equals, but of imposed hierarchy. The kind of subordination that chafed against Persian cultural pride and Achaemenid dynastic ambition, without providing an obvious route to escape. Cyrus changed the obvious. His rebellion against Astyages, which tradition dates to approximately 553 BCE, was not, at its outset, a bid for world empire. It was a bid for Persian independence, for the liberation of his people from a Median overlordship, that whatever its particular character under Astyages, represented a ceiling on Persian ambition and a constraint on Achaemenid authority. The specific triggers of the rebellion are not recoverable with certainty from the available sources. What is clear is that Cyrus moved against his Median overlord with military force and political calculation simultaneously. That two instruments that he would continue to use in combination through his career with a sophistication that distinguished him from conquerors who relied on military force alone. The political calculation involved Harpagus. The Median general whose son had been served to him at Astyages' banquet had spent years in patient preparation. When Cyrus raised his standard, Harpagus was ready, had been cultivating the network of Median officers whose loyalty to Astyages was conditional and whose willingness to switch allegiance was available at the right price. Which in Harpagus's case was not merely personal advancement, but the specific satisfaction of watching the king, who had destroyed his family, lose everything. He made contact with Cyrus. He offered his defection and the defection of the forces under his command. He offered, in other words, to turn the Median army against the Median king at the decisive moment, transforming a military contest between Persia and Media into a political collapse of the Median state from within. The strategy worked with a completeness that went beyond what either party had perhaps expected. When the decisive battle between Cyrus's Persian forces and Astyages' Median army was joined at Pasargadae around 550 BCE, Harpagus led his forces across to the Persian side on the field. Astyages, confronted with the defection of a major portion of his army, was captured rather than killed in battle. The Median Empire did not fall through the destruction of its army, or the systematic conquest of its territory. It fell through the defection of its own military command. Through the collapse of the loyalty that was the only thing holding its coercive authority together. And here, in the moment of his first great victory, Cyrus made the decision that announced what kind of conqueror he was going to be. He did not execute Astyages. He did not torture him, or humiliate him publicly in the manner that ancient conquerors typically employed to demonstrate the completeness of their victory. He kept him at court, the defeated king of the empire that Cyrus had just absorbed, living in the presence of his conqueror as a strange, kind of honored prisoner. His life preserved, his dignity maintained to a degree that the standards of the ancient world in no way required. Why? The answer requires understanding something about how Cyrus thought about power that separated him from every ruler who had preceded him in the ancient Near East. He was not interested in the performance of victory for its own sake. He was interested in the creation of stable authority, in building an empire whose subjects had reasons to accept its rule rather than merely the inability to resist it. Executing defeated kings produced clear demonstrations of power. It also produced the specific desperation in conquered peoples that makes resistance permanent, rather than temporary, the knowledge that surrender means death, that collaboration means nothing, that the conqueror's mercy is unavailable, and therefore worth nothing inducement to peaceful submission. Sparing Astyages sent a different message to every subsequent ruler who would contemplate resistance or submission to the approaching Persian army. Cyrus was not coming to destroy. He was coming to absorb. The Median nobles who had served Astyages were incorporated into the Persian administrative system. That their expertise, their networks, their knowledge of the theories they had administered, all preserved and redirected into the service of the new empire. The Median capital of Ecbatana became one of the Persian royal residences. Median cultural and administrative traditions were integrated rather than replaced. The Median Empire did not simply cease to exist and become Persia. It became part of Persia, transformed and redirected, but not obliterated. Its people not subjected to deportation or systematic humiliation, but incorporated into a new imperial structure that offered them a role, rather than merely demanding their submission. This was the template. Cyrus would use it again. And again. Each application would be adapted to the specific circumstances of the kingdom being absorbed. Each would combine military pressure with political offer. Each would promise conquered peoples. Something that no previous conqueror had promised. Not just survival, but participation. Not just the cessation of resistance, but the positive incentive of being part of something larger than what they had been before. The ancient world was watching. Some were watching with astonishment. Some were watching with fear. The king of Lydia, Croesus, the richest monarch in the world, was watching with what he believed was strategic intelligence, and what was actually the catastrophic overconfidence of a man who consulted an oracle, received an ambiguous answer, and interpreted it as he wished rather than as it meant. He was about to learn the difference. Croesus of Lydia was not a fool. He was, by the standards of his age and his world, an exceptionally capable king, a ruler who had expanded Lydian power across the whole of western Anatolia, who had developed the world's first true coinage system, and used the wealth it generated to build one of the ancient world's most spectacular treasuries, who had cultivated diplomatic relationships with Greece and Egypt and Babylon, that gave Lydia potential allies impressive enough to make any enemy's calculation of the costs of war against it sobering. He consulted the oracle at Delphi before moving against Cyrus. The oracle's response was the most famous ambiguity in the history of divination. If Croesus crosses the Halys River and attacks the Persians, a great empire will be destroyed. Croesus heard what he wished to hear. He assumed the empire to be destroyed was the Persian one. He assembled his forces, crossed the Halys River into Persian-controlled Cappadocia, and engaged Cyrus's army in a battle, the Battle of Tyria around 547 BCE, that ended indecisively. He retreated back across the Halys for the winter, expecting the campaign to pause for the season according to the conventions that ancient Near Eastern warfare typically followed, and sent messages to his allies, Egypt, Babylon, Sparta, requesting that they gather their forces for a joint campaign the following spring. Cyrus did not wait for spring. He crossed the Halys in winter. An operation that violated the military conventions of the era with the same, for conventional limitations that he would demonstrate repeatedly throughout his career, and arrived before Lydia's capital Sardis before Croesus had finished demobilizing his army. The subsequent battle on the plain before Sardis, the Lydian army's famous cavalry charge, broken not by Persian counter-cavalry, but by the smell of Cyrus's camels, which panicked the Lydian horses in a detail that ancient sources preserve with obvious delight, ended in Persian victory, and the siege of Sardis itself. The city fell within 2 weeks. Croesus was captured. The empire destroyed was Lydia's. Again, as with Astyages, Cyrus did not kill his captured royal prisoner. The story of how Croesus was saved from his own funeral pyre is among the most famous tales in Herodotus, involving the intervention of Apollo in response to a prayer and an act of divine mercy. Whether the divine apparatus is credited or not, the historical outcome is clear. Croesus lived. He appears in later tradition as a kind of counselor at Cyrus's court, the former richest king in the world, offering the perspective of accumulated experience to the conqueror who had spared him. The symbolism was potent. The most powerful independent king in the Western world, reduced to a court advisor rather than a corpse, the mercy not merely individual but political. A demonstration readable by every kingdom between the Aegean and the Indus of what Cyrus's conquest meant for those who surrendered. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast, Miletus, Ephesus, Smyrna, and their neighbors, fell one by one to Persian authority following the conquest of Lydia. Some yielded quickly, calculating with the political intelligence that Cyrus's treatment of Croesus had made available. That resistance was likely to be more costly than submission. Some resisted and paid the price of resistance. But the overall pattern was absorption rather than annihilation. Greek city-states continuing to exist, continuing to govern themselves internally, continuing to maintain their cultural and religious practices, under the umbrella of Persian imperial authority, rather than under the Persian boot in the manner of Assyrian or Babylonian conquest. Then Cyrus turned east. The campaigns of the late 540s and early 530s BCE, in which Persian forces pushed eastward across the Iranian plateau and into the territories of Central Asia, are less precisely documented than the Western conquests, but are attested in the administrative records of the empire and in later sources. Bactria and Sogdia, the territories of modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, were brought under Persian authority. The eastern frontier of the empire was pushed toward the boundaries of the Indian subcontinent. The scale of the territory, being incorporated, required administrative systems capable of governing across distances that no previous empire had managed. Cyrus was building these systems as he went. The Persian imperial administration that he developed, which his successors Cambyses and Darius would refine into the elaborate satrapal system documented in detail by Greek historians, was built on the same philosophical foundation as his approach to conquest. Rather than replacing existing administrative systems, with Persian bureaucracy in every newly absorbed territory, Cyrus used existing structures where they functioned, retained local officials where they were competent and cooperative, and imposed Persian authority as a supervisory layer above local governance rather than as a replacement for it. The practical advantages were enormous. An empire building speed did not have time to train sufficient Persian administrators to govern all the territories being absorbed. Using existing administrative capacity, Median officials in Media, eventually Babylonian officials in Babylon, allowed the empire to function before its own bureaucracy had time to develop. But the advantages were not only practical. They were also political. Local officials who retained their positions under Persian rule had personal incentives to make Persian rule work. Populations governed by familiar faces speaking familiar layer faces speaking familiar administrative patterns were populations less likely to experience the new imperial authority as alien occupation demanding resistance. The distinction between liberation and conquest, which Cyrus's propaganda consistently emphasized, was not purely rhetorical. In many of the territories he absorbed, Persian rule genuinely represented an improvement on what had preceded it. By the time Cyrus turned his attention to Babylon, he had demonstrated this pattern sufficiently that the world's greatest city was already divided between those who feared his approach and those who, actively, desired it. The fall of Babylon would be the defining moment of Cyrus's career. It would happen in a way that the ancient world had never seen before. Babylon was not merely a city. It was the center of the world, or at least of the world as the ancient Near East understood itself. Its ziggurats rose above the Mesopotamian plain in physical declarations of divine proximity. Its walls, described by Herodotus as so thick that a four-horse chariot could turn on their top, enclosed an urban area that contained tens of thousands of people in a complexity of temples, palaces, markets, workshops, and residential neighborhoods that made it the most sophisticated urban environment on Earth in the 6th century BCE. Its intellectual life encompassed astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and a literary tradition that included the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving literary masterpiece, whose themes of friendship, loss, and the search for meaning had been refined and recorded on clay tablets in Babylonian libraries for over 1,000 years before Cyrus's birth. It was also, by 539 BCE, a city with a problem. The problem was its king, who had come to the Babylonian throne in 556 BC through a palace coup of uncertain character, was one of the most idiosyncratic rulers in the history of the ancient world. His religious preferences centered on the moon god Sin rather than on Marduk, the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon and the divine patron of the Babylonian state, whose annual New Year festival, the Akitu, was the central ritual of Babylonian royal legitimacy. By failing to participate in the Akitu festival, by removing statues of other gods from their temples and concentrating them in Babylon in ways that alienated the priestly establishments of multiple cities, and by spending extended periods at the Oasis city of Tema, in Arabia while leaving Babylon under the regency of his son Belshazzar, Nabonidus had managed to accomplish something that Cyrus could not have achieved through military force alone. He had alienated the Babylonian priestly class, the institutional backbone of Babylonian political legitimacy. The priests of Marduk were not passive victims of royal religious policy. They were the custodians of the ideological infrastructure of Babylonian civilization. The men who controlled access to the god, whose favor legitimized Babylonian kingship, who managed the enormous economic resources of the temple complexes that dominated Babylonian urban life, and who possessed the institutional authority to declare a king legitimate or illegitimate in terms that the Babylonian population was culturally conditioned to take seriously. When Nabonidus's religious policies offended them, they did not merely complain. They began carefully to look for alternatives. Cyrus provided the alternative with characteristic political intelligence. His propaganda campaign for Babylon, and it was unmistakably a propaganda campaign, conducted through diplomatic channels and through the message travelers and traders carried into the city, was built around a specific theological argument. Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, had been offended by Nabonidus's neglect. Marduk had chosen a new champion, a king from the east who would restore the god's proper worship, who would return the displaced divine statues to their temples, who would perform the Akitu festival that Nabonidus had failed to observe. That champion was Cyrus. This was not casual propaganda. It was a sophisticated theological operation that required deep familiarity with Babylonian religious culture, with what Marduk meant to the Babylonians, with what the Akitu festival represented, with the specific grievances of the priestly class, and the specific promises that would address them. Cyrus or his advisors understood Babylonian religious politics with a precision that suggests either exceptional intelligence work or, more likely, direct access to Babylonian informants with inside knowledge of the institutional conflicts that were fracturing the city's political coherence. The military campaign that accompanied this propaganda was swift and decisive. Cyrus's general Gobryas, another defector from the Persian side of the equation, a Babylonian governor who had joined the Persian cause, for reasons that ancient sources connect to personal grievances against Nabonidus, commanded the Persian forces that defeated the Babylonian army at the Battle of Opis in 539 BCE. The defeat was comprehensive. Nabonidus fled. The city of Sippar surrendered without significant resistance. And then, on the third day of Marcheshvan in 539 BCE, a date precisely recorded in the Babylonian chronicles, Persian forces entered Babylon. Without a battle. The Babylonian chronicle records the event with a terseness that renders it almost entomactic. The Persian troops entered Babylon. Cyrus offered peace to the city. No houses were plundered. No temples were burned. The normal life of the city, its markets, its workshops, its domestic routines, continued without the interruption that military conquest in the ancient world invariably produced. The city that had held the ancient world in awe for centuries opened its gates and let Cyrus. The Cyrus cylinder, the clay barrel, shaped inscription that Cyrus had deposited in the walls of Babylon's chief temple, records the ideology of this conquest in terms that still possessed the power to move readers 25 centuries after its composition. Speaking in the voice of the king himself, the text describes Marduk's choice of Cyrus as the righteous ruler to restore proper worship. The peaceful entry into Babylon, the release of those held captive, the return of displaced divine statues to their home temples, and the restoration of religious practices that Nabonidus had disrupted. The text is royal propaganda. It serves Cyrus's political interests, and should be read with appropriate critical distance. But it is propaganda built around a real policy, and the policy it describes is confirmed by other contemporary sources. Cyrus freed the captive peoples. This is not a metaphor. This is documented imperial policy, attested in Babylonian administrative records, in the Hebrew Bible, and in the Cyrus cylinder itself. The peoples whom Babylonian conquest had deported and resettled, the Judeans, most famously, but also the people of other cities and regions who had been subjected to the standard Babylonian practice of forced resettlement, were permitted to return to their homelands. Their divine statues, the physical representations of their gods that had been carried away as spoils of conquest, and deposited in Babylon's temples, were returned. Cyrus provided funding from the imperial treasury for the reconstruction of temples that Babylonian conquest had destroyed. For the Jewish exiles in Babylon, the decree of Cyrus was not merely political relief. It was theological confirmation of prophetic promises that their captivity had seemed to deny. Isaiah had prophesied return. Cyrus, a Persian king who had never heard of the God of Israel before his conquest of the region, was fulfilling that prophecy. The Hebrew Bible's description of Cyrus as the Lord's anointed, Messiah was not hyperbole. It was the theological interpretation of a historical event that the community experiencing it could only understand as the fulfillment of divine promise. The empire at its height stretched from the Aegean to the borders of India, the largest political entity the world had yet created, encompassing dozens of peoples, hundreds of languages, multiple religious traditions, and a diversity of cultures that no previous empire had attempted to govern without systematic suppression. Cyrus governed it through the principle that diversity was not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be managed, that peoples who retained their identities within the Persian imperial system were more loyal subjects than peoples whose identities had been erased by conquest. Persepolis, the great ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, captured this ideology in stone. The tribute processions, carved on the Apadana staircase at Persepolis, showed delegations from the 23 nations of the empire arriving to present their offerings. Each delegation rendered in the distinctive clothing, carrying in the distinctive goods, leading the distinctive animals of their specific culture. The artistic choice is not incidental. The Persians could have shown their subject peoples as anonymous, interchangeable figures distinguished only by the quantities of tribute they were delivering. Instead, they showed them as Lydians, as Maids, as Babylonians, as Ethiopians, as Indians, as peoples with specific identities that the empire recognized, accommodated, and in some sense celebrated. This was the peak of the Achaemenid achievement. An empire that conquered without erasing. A civilization built on the radical proposition that strength was not diminished by the diversity it contained. No empire is built without violence. The retrospective mythology of Cyrus as a conqueror, who waged war without bloodshed, is precisely that, mythology. Useful and meaningful mythology that captures something true about the relative character of Persian imperial practice, without accurately representing the complete historical reality. Cyrus fought battles. His armies killed people. Cities that resisted were subjected to sieges that cost lives on both sides and occasionally to punitive measures that followed the norms of ancient warfare, even when they violated the ideals of Persian imperial rhetoric. The distinction between the Achaemenid approach and that of the Assyrians or Babylonians was real and historically significant, but it was a distinction of degree and tendency rather than an absolute difference between violence and non-violence. The Eastern campaigns, the extension of Persian authority into Bactria, Sogdia, and the territories beyond, involved military operations in landscapes and against peoples for whom the political inducements that had worked in Lydia and Babylon were less applicable. The nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples of Central Asia did not have temples whose restoration could earn Persian favor. They did not have institutional religious hierarchies that Persian theological propaganda could court. They were mobile populations organized around tribal loyalties and the military culture of steppe warfare, people for whom negotiated submission carried different costs and benefits than for the urban civilizations of the Western Near East. The campaigns against these Eastern peoples were hard. Ancient sources are less detailed about them than about the Western conquests, that the Greek historians, who are our primary narrative sources for Cyrus's career, had more information about, and more interest in, the Western kingdoms that interacted directly with the Greek world. But the administrative evidence of the empire's eastern territories confirms that the region was genuinely brought under Persian authority, and that the process required sustained military effort, rather than politically engineered capitulations that characterized Cyrus's most famous conquests. The internal management of so vast an empire also generated its own crisis. Governing territory stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, encompassing dozens of different peoples, languages, legal systems, and administrative traditions through a Persian imperial structure that was, in Cyrus's own reign, still being improvised as it was deployed, created inevitable tensions between central authority and local autonomy. The satraps, the governors whom Cyrus appointed to administer the empire's major provinces, were typically members of the Persian or Median nobility, whose personal loyalty to the king was the primary guarantee of their reliability. But personal loyalty is a fragile administrative mechanism at a distance. The satrap of a remote province, sufficiently far from the center to operate without regular supervision, had both the opportunity and the temptation to pursue interests that diverged from imperial policy. These tensions would become more acute under Cyrus's successors, but even in Cyrus's own reign, The challenge of maintaining coherent authority over an empire of unprecedented geographic scale was visible in the administrative experimentation that his inscriptions and the archaeological record reflect. There was also the question of Babylon itself, the city that Cyrus had entered as a liberator, whose priestly class had welcomed him as the chosen instrument of Marduk, whose captive populations he had freed, whose temples he had promised to restore, was not simply a grateful subject. It was the ancient capital of a civilization with its own deep tradition of imperial authority, its own political culture, its own sense of what it meant to be the center of the world. Absorbing Babylon into the Persian imperial system required ongoing political management that went the dramatic theatrical moment of the bloodless conquest. Cyrus and his advisors had to continuously demonstrate that Persian imperial rule was preferable to Babylonian independence, had to deliver on the specific promises that the Cyrus cylinder had made, had to manage the expectations of a Babylonian priestly class that had accepted Persian rule in exchange for religious restoration, and was watching carefully to see whether those expectations would be honored. The tensions between Persian central authority and Babylonian local identity would eventually produce the rebellions that troubled later Achaemenid kings. Notably the Babylonian revolts against Darius I and Xerxes that resulted in the very destruction of temples that Cyrus had promised to restore. But in Cyrus's own reign, the political management of Babylon appears to have been largely successful. The combination of genuine policy implementation and the enormous good generated by the liberation of captive peoples, giving Persian authority in the city a legitimacy that purchased through terror could not have produced. The greatest crisis of Cyrus's reign, the military confrontation that would cost him his life, came not from any of the great kingdoms he had absorbed, but from the northeastern frontier of his empire, where the Pasargadae, a confederation of nomadic peoples under a queen named Tomiris, occupied the steppe territories beyond the Araxes River. The confrontation had its origins in Cyrus's own attempt to apply to the Pasargadae the diplomatic methods that had worked so effectively elsewhere. He proposed marriage to Tomiris. She refused. She understood, Herodotus records, that the proposal was not for her sake, but for the sake of her kingdom, that Cyrus wished to acquire through matrimonial alliance what he could not easily acquire through military conquest against a mobile nomadic people on their own terrain. Her refusal was not merely personal rejection, but strategic clarity. She saw through the diplomatic instrument to the imperial ambition it served. Cyrus crossed the Araxes anyway. The campaign against the Pasargadae was, by the standards of Cyrus's career, anomalous. It was the one major military engagement of his life that was not preceded by the political preparation, the cultivation of internal divisions, the theological propaganda, the offer of terms generous enough to make resistance seem costlier than submission, that had characterized his most successful conquests. The Pasargadae were nomads. They had no temples to restore. They had no captive populations to liberate. They had no priestly class nursing grievances against their current ruler that Persian diplomacy could court. They were a confederation of steppe warriors organized around military independence of peoples who had never been conquered by anyone because the terrain they inhabited and the mobility that defined their way of life made them extraordinarily difficult to defeat comprehensively. Tomiris warned Cyrus directly. Ancient sources preserve her warning in terms that carry the authentic voice of a ruler who understands both her enemy and the situation with complete clarity. She told him to withdraw from her territory. She offered him with frank military assessment. The Pasargadae were not afraid of the Persian army. If he crossed the Araxes, she would give him his fill of blood. The warning was not the proud boasting of a ruler who underestimated her enemy. It was the precise military and political judgment of a woman who commanded at every confederation on terrain that favored her forces and who had accurately assessed both Cyrus's strengths and his weaknesses. Cyrus did not withdraw. What happened in the campaigns that followed is reconstructed from sources, primarily Herodotus, that are acknowledged to contain legendary elements alongside historical ones. The initial engagement went well for the Persians. A portion of the Pasargadae force, led by Tomiris's son Spargapises, was defeated and captured through a combination of military tactics and what ancient sources describe as deliberate baiting, a camp deliberately left with wine and food. exploiting the unfamiliarity of steppe warriors with the intoxicating wine that Persian culture consumed as a matter of course, capturing the incapacitated soldiers including the royal prince. Spagopizes, captured and sobered, killed himself rather than remain a prisoner. Tomiris's response was the response of a mother and a queen, and the two were inseparable in the terms she chose to express it. She sent a message to Cyrus. She told him that his treachery had killed her son, not his valor. She told him she would give him his fill of blood, as she had promised. The final battle. Somewhere in the steppe territory of what is now Central Asia, in 530 BCE, was, according to Herodotus, the fiercest battle that any barbarian nation had ever fought. The Pasargadae drove the Persian forces back. Cyrus the Great, the king who had never lost a major military engagement. The conqueror of the Medes and Lydians and Babylonians. The liberator of the captive peoples of the ancient Near East. The ruler whose mercy had become the most powerful diplomatic weapon in the ancient world, was killed. He was approximately 70 years old. He had ruled for approximately 30 years. He had built the largest empire in the world. And he died in the dust of the Central Asian steppe, at the hands of the one people whose territory his model of conquest. The model that had worked everywhere else. The model built on political preparation and theological propaganda, and the offer of terms generous enough to make resistance seem costlier than submission. Could not penetrate. The ancient sources offer various accounts of what happened to his body. Herodotus records Tomiris's famous act of posthumous vengeance, dipping the head of the dead king in a vessel of blood, to give him the fill of blood she had promised. Other sources report that his body was recovered and returned to Persia for burial. The Persian royal tomb at Pasargadae, a simple, elegant stone structure that still stands today, whose spare geometry contrasts dramatically with the elaborate mortuary architecture of the Egyptian pharaohs, is the accepted burial site of Cyrus. The inscription that ancient sources record as having been carved on the tomb speaks with a quiet confidence that the simplicity of the structure reinforces. O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come, I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians their empire. Do not therefore grudge me this little earth that covers my body. The empire he had built did not die with him. His son Cambyses succeeded him, inherited the Achaemenid throne, and the imperial structure that Cyrus had created, and extended it further still, conquering Egypt in 525 BCE and adding the Nile civilization to the Persian imperial system. The conquest of Egypt completed the geographic project of Persian imperial expansion into the last of the great ancient civilizations of the Near East. But Cambyses' reign was troubled, marked by the strange episode of his own madness that Greek sources describe, by the rebellion of a pretender to the throne, by his own death under circumstances that ancient sources leave sufficiently ambiguous to have supported competing interpretations ever since. It was Darius I, who seized the throne in 522 BCE, through a combination of military force and political maneuvering that he then spent considerable effort legitimizing in the inscriptions at Byzantium, who consolidated and systematized what Cyrus had built. The satrapal administrative system, the royal road network, the standardized coinage, the elaborate ceremonial architecture of Persepolis, all of these were Darius's contributions to the Achaemenid achievement, building on the foundation of Cyrus's conquests and Cyrus's governing philosophy. But Cyrus was the founder, the father, Baba, empire's end.